I'm Paul Václavic, the conference chairman, and I want to keep my introduction to a minimum. We'll turn it up in a moment. Sound experts come along. Foundation of MRI falls into a period which, as you know, was a period of great diversity, old paradigms, or as we now call it with our pet names, old epistemologies, had been questioned more and more. New ways of thinking arose, and into this period, therefore, also the beginning of what became known as the Bateson group. A small group around Gregory Bateson who began to study human interaction from different perspectives. I'm not going to go into this because we have somebody who, three people, who really can tell us more about it than I joined late 60, and the MRI was already in existence then. As the Bateson group began to feel the need for a psychiatric consultant, they turned to Don D. Jackson, a psychiatrist who also, but for very different reasons, had become interested in the phenomena of interaction, and through this became one of the founders of family therapy. Type of therapy, as you know, that considers so-called mental illness, not the individual deficit, shortcoming, or whatnot of an individual, but rather a pattern of interaction that perpetuates certain, if you will, maladaptive behaviors. Bateson in 1959 founded MRI, and we are therefore well in our 26th year of existence. MRI in those days was one of the first 3 institutes in the United States in which family therapy is researched, practiced, taught. Our institute, to mention this just briefly, was the first to receive a government grant to study psychotherapy. So if Don Jackson were around, he better than anybody else would be in a position to tell us about the beginning, the past, and the future of the past. In his memory, we are holding these biannual MRI conferences. Let me, before I invite our first speaker to take the podium, let me talk about a couple of practical issues. There is no smoking in this room. Please don't lose your badges. They are your ticket to enter the meeting room. As you may have noticed, there are book sales on the side as you come in, on your left, as you go out on your right. A book signing party will be held, and I'll give you the exact time. It will be held on Saturday. Authors will be requested to sign the books. There is no taping in this room because the tapes are being produced professionally by Informatics, and their desk is as you walk out on the left. The tapes will be ready virtually on the same day, sometimes immediately at the end of the particular speaker's presentation. There are conversation hours, as you know from. Also in your folders you find evaluation forms that we would appreciate if you were to fill in on Sunday and leave with us in the appropriate boxes at the exit. And those of you who need continuing education credits, please fill in your cards. Both witticism and a commonplace remark to say that perhaps the real birth trauma consists in being the child of two famous parents. Mary Catherine Bateson is the exception to this rule. Like her father, she has become an anthropologist. She teaches at Amherst College. But on this occasion, in addition to her professional qualifications, she is also and foremost important because she's the author of a book on her parents and about herself, With a Daughter's Eye. And you will get, if you're interested, the book, of course, is available. Let me quote from one of the book reviews. Rarely will you find such precision of thought matched with such poetry of language, or for that matter, such precision of language joined to such poetry of thought. In addition to this, nobody is more competent to tell us about the man who has been absolutely determining our thinking and our ways of carrying on research than her father. It's a great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Catherine Mary Bateson.
I'm counting on you to shout at me if you can't hear. All right? I'm going to start with a story that my father told quite often in the last year of his life. He was increasingly using stories and parables to make his points. Some of you may have heard this story. It takes place at Esalen. There came to Esalen a psychic who, in communion with the ghosts of the great Impressionist painters, would sit down in trance and produce a Van Gogh, a Monet, a Degas. And everyone was most impressed. And they did discover, he said, rather have the look of those painters, though in a rather mediocre form. This is anybody who's ever been to a seance has been struck, no doubt, by the mediocrity of what comes out of the mouths, in theory, of the ghosts of Plato, Jesus, Napoleon, Hitler, people like that. They become extraordinarily dull people after their death. Well, these paintings, I guess, were hanging around at Esalen, and a couple of days later it was discovered that one of the many children at Esalen had taken a magic marker and defaced a Monet. And everyone was extremely upset at the sacrilege. Gregory was living at Esalen at the time, and he remarked over the breakfast table that what happened was really of profound significance, because he suggested the original painting had not been produced by the ghost of Monet, but was a forgery. But, said he, no doubt the ghost of Monet, comfortably resident in Hades, had arranged to deface the blasphemous forgery. 6-year-old with the magic marker. So said Gregory, the new painting, the defaced painting, was no doubt an original Monet that would be worth vast sums at auction. Well, Gregory got a lot of mileage out of that story, and I intend to get 3 times as much mileage out of it. One of the things that he did not use the story for, that I mean to use it for, was to talk about how really difficult it was sometimes to be his colleague. Here is this man living at Esalen, essentially as a guest. Now, I've described his role at Esalen was as resident skeptic. That is to say, he would poke fun gently at the things believed by the people around him, saying with various degrees of subtlety, you know, you're talking total nonsense. Okay? It's not the easiest kind of person to have around. And in the course of his life, he worked closely with many people, and then said, you got it wrong. You have misunderstood what I've been saying, right? And one wonders, and there's a sense in which the entire family therapy community had that experience, because Gregory's ideas are fundamental, have been woven to various degrees and into different kinds of approaches to family therapy. And yet here's this ghost sitting there, grumpy, complaining that this or that isn't getting it quite right. Okay? This is one of the legacies of the past that's worth thinking about and trying to understand. Trying to say, well, now what does one make of that? I've got some sympathy for people who invested vast periods of their lives into collaboration with Gregory, only to be told they haven't got it quite right. This is not the pleasantest experience, and only to see him go off in other directions. I also mean to use the story to exemplify the dangers of consulting with ghosts. I'm currently working on the materials, the manuscript that Gregory left at the time of his death, for a book to be called Where Angels Fear to Tread. And it's been sitting for quite a while. You know, Gregory died 5 years ago. And I had my book to finish. And I was engaged in an activity which he regarded as total nonsense, namely academic administration. I didn't get to it seriously until now. So now I sit and conduct seances. What did he have in mind? What was the transition from this idea to that idea that is totally missing from the stack of manuscripts? Why, to goodness sake, did he put this into the stack? What relationship can I find? The relationship being, of course, critical to making sense out of these pieces that he has left there. And I face every day in doing that a set of questions he said that perhaps the child had been possessed not by the ghost of Monet, but maybe Monet had a daughter. But then he said, but I haven't been able to discover that Monet had a daughter, so maybe it was Monet himself. Well, of course, anybody who ever worked with Gregory knows that I haven't been able to discover that Monet had a daughter. Does not refer to research efforts. It's kind of rhetorical. But in any case, he did leave me a responsibility, and it's a curious and ambivalent one. It's important. The ideas are important. The ideas as they are continually reshaped and worked with by the folk at MRI and other people in the family therapy field are important. And it's very difficult to work out the nature of the appropriate fidelity, especially in the context of Gregory's general orneriness. And it should be some comfort to people in the family therapy field who's... see, there were three groups of people to whom Gregory said, no, you're getting me wrong. There's a chapter in the book called Neither Supernatural Nor Mechanical. It's in that chapter that he tells the Monet story. And what he says is there are mechanistic types of scientists who are only interested in counting things and in reductionism of various sorts. They're all wrong. And then there are people who use my ideas to lend support to supernatural premises, which he said they no doubt believed in before they started. I certainly didn't lead them to those premises. And they're all wrong. That's the context in which he tells the Monet story, and I'll get to the nature of the disproof he's attempting there in a minute. And lastly, there are the people who take Gregory's ideas and say, there is work to be done with these ideas. Whether in trying to stop an arms race, or in trying to slow down the process of ecological degradation, or the work that most of you do day in, day out in therapy, trying as swiftly as possible to make family life a little more bearable for given families and individuals within them. And to that group, there isn't a chapter in the book addressing that group, but the title of the book, Where Angels Fear to Tread, is in many ways addressed to that group, to those who would wish to use ideas to bring about change. And Gregory was inclined to think that they will simply make things worse. One of the really rather complex aspects of my heritage is that Gregory as a father, with his pessimism about social action and change, I had my mother as a mother. And she was always inclined to say, well, we'll make a social invention. Think of a way of doing that. Bring about change. So it's a very confusing heritage to try and work out. And I would assume that there's a kind of complicated confusion in knowing that some of the key ideas by someone who was inclined to say, but don't use it. This is not meant to be used. Well, let's go back to the ghost of Monet. Gregory was engaged at that point in what's called a reductio ad absurdum proof. Many of you remember these from geometry. Though I don't think they tell the kids the Latin for it anymore. But what you do, you're asked to examine a statement. Right? Now, your ordinary geometrical proof, you go back to the axioms, and you go from the axioms step by step, deductively, to show that the truth of that statement is entailed by the axioms. But another way of proceeding is to say, suppose you're supposed to demonstrate that two lines are equal in length. Another way of proceeding is to say, well, let's for a minute imagine what would follow if they were unequal in length. And then you proceed from that step by step until you arrive at something which is manifestly absurd. Right? And then you say, well, the line of inference proposed by looking at it this way arrives at absurdity. We throw the whole line away and go back to the beginning because that premise has proved to be unacceptable. Gregory's point about the ghost of Monet is that once you start admitting certain kinds of beliefs, there's no way of closing the door. Okay, so you believe in Monet's ghost, and I'll believe in Monet's daughter's ghost. Why not? There's no way of preferring one author of the painting or the mark on the painting to the other. You open the door to total nonsense. And this got Gregory involved. There were other lines of interest that converged, but he got very interested in the whole question of the development of deductive reasoning and the relationship between the concepts of deductive reasoning and the emergence of heresy as an important idea in Western thought. It's heresy. It's a strange and interesting idea. The idea that a wrong idea or belief is of such great significance that through the history of the Western world there have been massacres, there have been inquisitions, the rooting out of wrong belief has been one of our less attractive obsessions. But underlying that belief is the belief that it matters. That the system of ideas that you hold is closely interrelated, and that a few false steps there, a few bad premises, few flaky extras are enough to corrupt the entire fabric. That's what the concept of heresy is about. And I think it is arguable that you only develop the concept of heresy after you have developed the concepts of deductive logic. Otherwise, you can have a group of ideas that have a kind of aesthetic coherence. They seem to hang together. You don't develop the habit of saying, well, either this or that. You can't have them both as truths. You get multiple versions of the same myth, multiple origin stories for different aspects of the natural world, and up to a certain point, and indeed in most of the world's cultures, one can live with the contradictions quite comfortably. At a certain point in intellectual history, it apparently became urgent to try and winkle out contradictions and achieve consistency. And you get these incredible monuments of human intellectual prowess, such as the Summa Theologica. You may not agree with the premises, but the structure existed from those premises is magnificent. You may not believe in any premises quite that firm. Before I leave the questions of geometry, though, I wanted to tell you one more thing about these seances. You know, I've worked with Gregory on and off over the years. And he wrote these little things called metalogs, which are, of course, fictionalized, and which they contain pieces of actual remarks made. They're not totally fictional. And there's no way that I can deconstruct them and find out now exactly what was anecdotally accurate and what's made up. But it becomes a very complicated circular system, because if your father writes fiction about you, or indeed, as has often been the case historically, your uncle and occasionally your mother, whether your name is Christopher Robin or Alice or whoever it may be, it does begin to have a shaping effect on you, right? Your father writes monologues, father-daughter dialogues, and where you become old enough to read them, you begin to say, oh, that's the kind of relationship he wants us to have. Okay, so you start doing your bit to converge on the monologues as a modality of relationship. And since there is a sense in which they start from reality, the dialogue form becomes a very significant one in life. Well, there were the monologues, there were conferences that we did together. There were situations, say, at the Lindisfarne Institute, where we kind of conducted public argument about this or that, knowing that, of course, we were tweaking the imaginations of the audience to remember the monologues. And we get wheels within wheels within wheels in all of this. And of course I worked on our own metaphor conference and Mind and Nature. And one of the things that always sort of puzzled me was the way in which anything I said simply disappeared either it was totally forgotten or it was incorporated in Gregory's thought, and he had no memory whatsoever of having heard it from someone else. Now, there may be many women in the audience. Probably every woman in the audience has had the privilege of saying something to some male who says, and has zero memory subsequently that any such thing was said, right? And many have had the privilege of working as collaborators with men who looked at them as if they were basically performing a clerical task, and you occasionally make a rather gentle, substantive remark, which that's just what I was thinking. That comes the answer, right? So this is a familiar experience, and I was kind of inclined to think that was what was going on. Except I think there's another layer there that probably arose with everyone who worked with Gregory. I think I can explain this by a sort of imaginary picture of Euclid. We're back to geometry. Euclid was a real person, as presumably was Homer. And, however, neither Euclid nor Homer was the author of the books attributed to them. Each of them received a tradition which they built on and elaborated, and the Homeric epics we now believe had existed for a long time as oral literature. At some stage they got written down. It isn't even sure that there was a poet named Homer. Euclid, there was such a person, but he did not invent the entire set of ideas that we call geometry. All right, so this isn't the real Euclid I'm talking about. I'm talking about a sort of emblematic Euclid. And he's sitting there, looking like a freak, dressed in a sheet. And one of his disciples comes running up, full of enthusiasm. And he says, "Master, I've discovered 3 new theorems." And he goes through them. And Euclid says to him, "That's right. That's there." You're not hearing me. That was there all along, those theorems. Nothing new. You've just noticed some connections between things that are contained in the axioms. The theorems are immanent, a good Bateson word, in the axioms. When you draw them out, well, once you get it, you're saying the obvious, aren't you? And one does rather feel for Euclid's disciple, who thought he'd produced something new, and was told that that's been there all along. So this was the other thing that Gregory was inclined to say, that represents, I think, an important truth about the relationship between ideas. And heaven knows, you know, if I could generate another theorem after all these years in Euclidean geometry, it would be no mean feat, no mean creative feat, even though, in another sense, that's all there already in the axioms. Gregory also believed that he was working within a deductive system of closely interrelated ideas that was finally tautological. The word tautology became progressively more important in his thought. No, tautology is a statement like, if A equals B, then A equals B. That is, you start with some axioms, A equals B, and it includes all those statements which are immanent in those axioms, down to and including the restatement of what you said in the first place. But sometimes you elaborate and you turn it around and you get if A equals B, then B equals A. That's a step in the elaboration of what is essentially a tautological system. And that is what Gregory believed about his own thought as it was developing towards the end of his life. That finally it was tautological. It would recognizably coalesce, and that the internal structure of that system of thought, the tautological structure of that system of thought, was parallel to and comparable with the interdependencies of the ecological world. And I think in the metalogue at the end of Mind and Nature, he uses the phrase a self-healing tautology. Rips appear in it, and then it grows back. The interdependencies reassert themselves. An ecosystem at climax is really maximally interlocked. And that the same is true. You could make mistakes. You can make mistakes in thought. You can talk nonsense. We all can. But that he was working towards an essentially tautological system. And therefore, when you talk to him, if he disagreed with what you said, he was inclined to think that what you were saying was of the nature of heresy, about which he might be polite and he might not be polite. And if you agreed with him, he was kind of inclined to say, yes, that's all there. And of course, during the years when Gregory was most closely associated with people that went on to make such major contributions in the field of family therapy, he did not yet quite have this sense of the integration of his own thought. In a sense, the decision to put together the book, Steps to an Ecology of Mind, is the landmark that says, for Gregory, it is now clear to me that I've only talked about one thing ever. It's all the same issue. And I think that was less clear to him earlier. But my guess is it was that the style. I've been told that Cambridge in the 20s was a very Platonist sort of place anyhow. People believing that ideas are real. And you have this sense with Gregory of trying to get to the ideas which are there. As indeed in another sense, they are an immanent sense. heresy. The trade of therapy has had some experience of issues of heresy. We all live in the shadow of the effort to preserve Freud's ideas as a coherent whole. Right? For most people here, I would assume the easiest place to look to understand issues of heresy, orthodoxy, excommunication, and other such things is not the medieval Roman Catholic Church, about which relatively few of us are well informed, but the modern psychoanalytic tradition. One of the things that I feel very strongly and deeply about is I am not going to get dragged into that game. I go to meetings. I go to fewer and fewer of them, at which people talk about my father's ideas. And they have this dreadful habit of looking at me, see if I'm nodding. Well, I do that when I speak. People that nod at me make me feel happy. Look for the occasional nod. But it is not easy or comfortable for me to have to be deciding whether to, well, you're all therapists, you know about nodding. It's not easy or comfortable for me to have to make that decision. And particularly, I went to a conference in France at a place called Symposium, to which a day or so later came Moni Alpine, who were also here. And they were expecting me to nod when they were talking French. and I was desperately trying to hang on and understand it, developing a huge headache. And I went out in the garden, what do you do? And that's my general feeling about much of this, that I'm not prepared to be in the position of nodding or not nodding. And there's really a very nice garden outside. It is perhaps because of the Freudian tradition that the issue arises more often in relation to Gregory's work than in relation to my mother's work. It's as if her work, for the people to whom it was important, at different levels of abstraction and completeness, had sunk into them and become their common sense. So that nobody has a sense, it seems to me, of a single coherent body of ideas that you could objectify and defend. Now, Derek Freeman feels he can objectify it and attack it, but that's a different phenomenon and no doubt related to his family history. With Gregory, it's different. You know, Gregory thinks it's weird. It is not our common sense way of thinking. He is, in an important sense, at odds with the civilization. One tries, reading him, working through the material, to adapt his basic positions about the communicational nature of biological and social worlds, to think systematically about context, to attend to issues like difference, to all this stuff, you know. And it's very hard, and I think pretty alien. And very productive. Well worth doing. Whether I think of myself as able to do it well, as having done it in repeated interactions with Gregory, and I don't for a minute think of myself as consistently and pervasively and completely having adopted his premises. No, I'm like the physicist who does his physics all day, and then he goes, gets in his car and drives it home at a speed which a little bit of reflection would show him would make it impossible to brake before hitting the car in front of him. And what do you do? And of course, I have commitments to social change, social action, political concerns, concerns about the health of institutions that Gregory was inclined to think were nonsense. So it's clear to me, as I make decisions in my life, that I'm not making those decisions consistently on his premises, even though I could adopt those premises in playful conversation with him. In any case, for whatever reason, I think one has to consider, I have to consider, you have to consider, the folk of MRI have to consider, what do we do about this legacy? What do we do with these ideas, these tapes, these articles that are lying around, circulating, being reworked in workshops and so on? There is a corresponding complementary danger to the danger of constructing an orthodoxy. And that is the danger of fragmentation. That's the typical American danger. Let me tell you. Take a system of ideas put together as a coherent whole and pull out a piece and put it together with a piece pulled out of another system. Okay? It's at that point that you start saying Monet's ghost has charisma. Which is a perfect example of the charisma pulled out of Faber's work. A perfect example of an idea pulled out of someone's work, the context forgotten, something that was integrated into the system of ideas, now treated as a nice little pellet that you can move over and pop into something else. And we do it constantly in this way. And there are people who are clever enough to construct their ideas in pellet form. That's one solution. One pellet of a given, one pill of a given capsule of a given thinker before bedtime will do a world of good. And you don't have to really worry about how it fits into other things. Unfortunately, there is a sense in which my mother's work is like that. It tolerates the being disassembled. Sometimes that produces caricature, but still, people get a bit of this and a bit of that, and may be helpful for helping. It doesn't work with Gregory's thing. This, I think, is the thing that drove him berserk about the double bind. When you invent a noun, like schismogenesis never got picked up much, except by New Guinea anthropologists. So schismogenesis doesn't get carted around like charisma, reified, popped into new contexts. But he always tended to be very distressed at the way people would use the double bind concept away from his kind of very complex understanding of contexts of communication and meta-communication and so on. And it's exactly that's the issue. And of course the thing that, he liked the people at Essendon. He was inclined to think that people who talk about out-of-body experiences and practice various forms of divination and pay attention to coincidences were nicer people than very hard-headed folk that contradict and reject all of this stuff. He was happier in that kind of context. But you see, exactly the issue of the Monet's ghost story is that if you start pulling in bits of this and bits of that, and you say, well, it isn't going to disrupt my cosmology to believe in an extra ghost here and there. Well, it is going to disrupt your cosmology. One pill of ghost belief is like a corrosive acid to reasonable thinking. Right? So, as I say, I am haunted, rather literally, by a double concern. On the one side, there is a personal determination that I am not going to get into the position of saying this is orthodox and that isn't. That is the life I do not wish to lead. On the other hand, I do think from time to time, my concern must be to remind people that without the characteristics of formal consistency that underlay Gregory's thought is probably worthless. Odds and ends. Nice, charming, engaging, usable as gimmicks. One of the things that horrified him, I suppose that's sort of a translation of what I was saying, the pill of ideas. Usable, but finally not of significance. Now, we all live in a culture in which knowledge is organized in these little pits. We read magazines. We listen to news broadcasts on television. We go to workshops. We get large and small pips of ideas, and then in the next hour, in front of your television set, or with your magazine, or maybe in this room today, I don't know, in the next hour, we hear something that, heaven help us, cannot coexist on grounds of logical reasoning, but it floats by. There's an irony here, because I don't think Gregory ever quite made it. I may be wrong. It's the kind of thing I can get away with saying. The coalescence of his way of thinking into an internally consistent system, I think never entirely happened. There are odds and ends and pips floating around here. And that's one of the reasons why I would hate to see it set up as an orthodoxy. Because, of course, what happened to Freudian orthodoxy, among other things, is that this magnificent creation of Dr. Freud, these incredibly perceptive ideas, got frozen in a form that contained ideas from the culture of the time, bits and pieces of old Vienna, bits and pieces of nonsense and self-deception and all that other stuff. And the Freudians got themselves in a position of having to defend the whole kit and caboodle. Instead of saying, oh yeah, sure, Freud was wrong all the time. But not wholly wrong. That's what I kept trying to say about the Freeman thing. What's new? Of course anthropologists make mistakes in the field. And it's very important to correct them. Come on, let's get on with it. What's the fuss? So I'm not interested, for all of these reasons I've given you, in the orthodoxy business, whether pursued by me or by other people. But I am interested for this civilization, for all of us, trying to piece together ways of looking at the world and ways of acting in the world that will take due note of its complexity. I am interested in the business of consistency. I think I would say to anyone working with the ideas of Gregory Bateson that the thing to bear in mind is to try and control the impulse, to pull out a piece here and a piece there and put it to work. And stay with your puzzlement. Stay with the question that his students complained about again and again and again. Bateson, what are you after here? What does this have to do with that? What indeed, behind it all, is the pattern that connects? suppose you come to the microphone without raising your hand, so it would be handy. Yes?
I was a little puzzled by your last point about not pulling apart the theory, because in what you said earlier, I deduced, and maybe wrongly, a criticism of the notion that there is a kind of Platonic connection of ideas, and that there is this pattern that connects it all in a consistent fashion. The way I interpreted what you were saying earlier about your commitment to social change and the idea that things ought to be changed was that you're criticizing this idea that there's something inherently there that you're going to find. And if you do make that criticism, I'm wondering, why not parcel things out? I guess I'm wondering a little bit more about your epistemology, because on the one hand, I heard that criticism, and then you were saying, well, no, you have to be consistent. I don't know if that question is clear.
Right. Yes, it is. Very clear. Thank you for it. I think that the coherence, the connectedness is real and a real aspiration, but not fully realized. I don't think of it as a will-o'-the-wisp that was being pursued. I think of it as an aspiration that was being pursued and should continue to be pursued. Platonists. You see, the difficulty with Platonism is it becomes a theory of the transcendent existence of ideas, or of mind, or what have you. And what Gregory was arguing for was the immanence of these. Now, sometimes he really talks as if a concept was there and you could grab it on the wing. But at the same time, that is, although it's been a familiar enough idea, goodness knows, in human thought, but that is a playful expression of the more profound conviction that concepts are embodied in the material organizations of, or in the organization of material objects, organisms, and so on in the biological and social world. I think, so the answer to the first half of the question is that I am not, I'm sorry, I'm making you stand here so long, I have to give long answers. The answer to the first half of the question is that although I don't think Gregory entirely and finally succeeded in presenting the fully interlocked system. I don't think he was going to in this book yet either. I think the notion and the aspiration are important to hang on to. I would not take the fact that that final coalescence did not occur as a reason to disassemble and scatter all of the pieces. Now, the answer to the second question is, Gregory kept coming back to the question of how is it possible to act in the world, given the epistemology I've been talking. You think of this business about two organisms in relation to each other are part of a single system, and I've got this tree in my backyard that I want to cut down so I'll have more sun. And cutting down that tree is sort of roughly comparable to having an abortion, which may also be okay, but it becomes a very hard decision when you say, hey, tree, you're like me. I'm like you. And furthermore, you and I are part of a single living being that I'm going to cut a piece off of. I am not prepared to decide never to cut a tree down. I'm prepared to go on working for ways of formulating solutions to the problem. I don't for a minute want you all to stop trying to help families in distress. This is the business of ordinary life, and we hope to do more good than damage, and we also go on working for ways to clarify it. Gregory felt that the clarification of this problem was finally going to be an aesthetic one, that the way in which one could act locally was to do good in minute particulars with an aesthetic point of view that would embody the vision of the whole. That, I think, is his solution to the question that is not entirely spelled out. I mean, maybe if you... I'm full of regret that I'm not going to see Virginia Satir, because I've always had the feeling that if one could always work in the conviction that one's therapy sessions were a dance and beautiful, it might be okay. Sorry.
Dave Mendel, Houston, Texas. I'm very appreciative of this opportunity to hear you. I've had many talks with Gregory Bateson and many workshops such as this, trying to establish truth and reality to guide us in our work in family therapy. But as I hear your gentle differentiating yourself from your father, it occurred to me that all this I've been studying about Gregory is basically a dialogue between Gregory and his father and the establishment. Also, I can see, with a domineering father like he had to be gentle. As an Englishman, he had to be very intelligent and delicate, but still questioning and really undermining his father all along. In other words, whether it's Freud or any orthodoxy, because characteristic of William Bateson was his strong stand on genetics. Well, Bateson is obviously the opposite. That's what I think.
I think the answer to that is thank you.
I just wanted to make more of a comment than ask a question. My own premise is that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to separate the person from the concept. And that part of what we're talking about, the essence, at least to me, is that this tautology was Gregory starting from himself and returning to himself. And it's very difficult when he's not here to be in touch with him, and thus for you to resolve him when he's not here. And I just wanted to empathize with this strong.
You know, Gregory frequently quoted a line of poetry from a poem called The Life After Death that speaks of where dead men meet and part. I've got the sequence wrong. never mind, it's not a correct quote. Where dead men meet and part and meet again, blah, 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 on lips of living men. Right? The interweaving of the ideas does go on, but it will change.
I'm having trouble with the microphone. My name is Judith Goldman. I'm from San Francisco. I'm interested in the whole issue of puzzles, and not only how people put the pieces of the puzzle together, but when any individual or any institution puts together a coherent puzzle, what would motivate them to take it apart?
I think you have to say what you mean by taking it apart. That could have many meanings.
When you put together a puzzle, let's look at a jigsaw puzzle. When you put together the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, you have something that makes sense. When you work with individuals or you work with institutions, they put together theories, they put together their lives, they put together different people. It makes sense. It's coherent. We can't see beyond that. And yet what we know that's of value, and it's also what I hear you saying, is that it is of value to take it apart and maybe join with pieces from another puzzle or put them together differently. And I know that in our work it's valuable to do that, but what can one do to motivate somebody or to challenge somebody to rethink the whole thing and to put it together differently or join with another person's puzzle?
Well, that's a terribly broad question, I think, about social and intellectual change. I think the nearest approach I can come to that is that there are people for whom this is the greatest joy in life. And they are important to have among us. But this may not be everyone's preoccupation. But that the sense of being able to separate the pieces of a puzzle, reassemble them, assemble them in new ways, is one of the great human pleasures. And I think probably one that in some ways we promote in this society. I think you can promote the interest in looking at the structure of a puzzle without promoting fragmentation or scattering or the breaking of an interesting whole.
Thank you. Thanks.
We have time for just one more brief question. Further questions can be asked this afternoon at the panel. So, gentleman here, please.
I have a very sparse acquaintance with Bateson's book, but I found it to be real interesting because it tended to move towards seeing systems as wholes. The metaphor, as I understand it, is like a cybernetic metaphor as opposed to seeing things only in their individual parts. I'm wondering how much contact did he have with, I don't know, maybe more fluid forms of systems analysis like Mead or Cooley or even Hegel or Marx that take sort of, I guess looking at a system as being able to change in its terms and perhaps being able to be clarified at the end of some process as Hegel would have and Marx would have. There seems to be maybe a stuckness to just looking at things as being in a cybernetic relationship with each other, where they can't be resolved in some more final way.
This is something that comes up constantly on the occasions when I do talk about basis ideas. If somebody says, but what is their relationship with Hegel or Buddhism or Durkheim or and the answer usually is that although Gregory was very well educated, up to 1930 or so. After 1930, he was extremely selective. He read little and with very high intensity. He was, and maybe this is what had to be for the preservation of his kind of mental process. Not eclectic. People would come along and say, "Oh, Gregory, you are going to love Teilhard de Chardin." Look at it and say, "Wow." And cybernetics for him means the Menta conferences in the 40s and I guess into the early 50s, and continuing conversations and reading the work of those people and half a dozen other major thinkers. The number of books that you have to have read to understand what Bateson has in his mind, of course you have to have a good classical education and all of that, but after that, which is what most of us don't have, after that the number's rather small. And who knows, it's hard to say whether, on the one hand, you kind of sometimes wish that Gregory had read this, and you think that would have been an important fertilization. But my feeling is that he was one of those thinkers who was growing a pear tree in his own yard. And the important thing was to let it grow and work out its own premises. Not be continually, what is it you do to trees when you fasten a piece of another tree on it? Not continually grafting in other things that might finally prove to be incompatible. Was that the last question?
That was the last question, and thank you again.
No, wait, I want to say one more thing. It goes back to an earlier, sorry, Paul. It goes back to an earlier question. One of the things that Gregory says in talking about, this goes back to the question of, well, what about your social and political concerns vis-a-vis Gregory's? He talks a lot about secrecy in relation to the sacred, about the notion that a certain level of unconsciousness, of blockage of information flow may be essential to the viability of a system. Now, that's precisely the kind of observation that when I read it, I say, yes, I see that's true, and I suppose I'm just a sort of liberal with a lot of liberal prejudices, but also at a deep level, I'm not prepared to believe that priestcraft and the esoteric and taboos on knowledge are the way we will solve these problems in the future, though they may have been important in the past. So Gregory's notion that controlling information flow is important in the viability of certain systems and related to the sense of the sacred. I see it. It makes sense. And I'm not prepared to run my society or my institution on that basis. I'm prepared to be alerted to the need to discover ways of translating that notion that will serve the same purpose.
Thank you very much. Let's reconvene exactly at 11 o'clock. We're going to hear Gregory Bateson himself talking about us. points that have been raised now. Thank you.
He was one of the